So thanks, everybody. Not only are we the last panel, but I'm a little intimidated by our extremely illustrious speakers. Everybody knows who Saskia Sassen is, so I'll be very brief. We always say that you're the Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia, as well as a member of the Committee of Global Thought. Cool. And your new book is Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, and that has been translated into 15 languages. Sassen was also awarded the very prestigious Príncipe de Asturias Prize in the Social Sciences, and is now a member of the Royal Academy of the Sciences of Netherlands, as well as being a member of the Center on Capitalism and Society. I think more recently, and I'm sure you'll be talking...
The most distinguished part, being a member of the Center.
Exactly. Yes. And of course, we all know your important work on cities, on migration, and on globalization. I've had the pleasure of being a friend of Liza's for probably 25 years now. So I even know Liza's biography pretty much by heart. Contributing editor at Columbia Journalism Review, at The Nation, now at Jacobin, wrote a terrific book on women at Walmart, also a book on Hillary Clinton as well, and I can cheat to get the exact title, and by looking at the sheet. And then, of course, you've been teaching at SIPA for several years now, and doing a wonderful job teaching a course on writing on policy. And your most recent book, of course, is Divining Desire, Focus Groups and the Culture of Consultation, which was published in February 2018, and I'm the proud owner of a copy. And of course, we all enjoyed reading False Choices, the Faux Feminism of Hillary Clinton, which Verso published, and was a very sort of hard, tough look at Hillary Clinton. So I think that it's the end of the day. I'm sure everyone's really looking forward to a discussion. So we'll start with brief remarks by our speakers, and then I think move into discussion and questions. Thank you very much for being here, and to the panelists.
Okay. I'm going to use the podium because I think we could all stand to wake up a little. When it comes to the problems facing women workers, corporate America has had a lot of hashtags to offer. This year's International Women's Day slogan, brought to you by MetLife, Amazon, McDonald's, and other companies, was hashtag balance for better, which doesn't even really make sense. Better balance for better what? So besides an economy in which companies make billions in profits, and many women workers can't even afford the gas to get to work, it's just so out of balance that many would just like to knock it right over. Recognizing that it takes more than hashtags for women to improve their lives, they've been increasingly organizing and going on strike. For the past couple years, teachers in the United States, especially in red states, have been striking and winning better pay and working conditions. They've also significantly affected the political landscape, making teacher pay and K-12 education, which is never an issue in presidential politics, it has become an issue in the Democratic primary. On International Women's Day, most women ignored the corporate hashtags, but in Argentina, Spain, Italy, Greece, Belgium, major public sector unions called for strikes in response to demand from their female members. In France, major French unions supported the strike, and it started at 3:40 p.m., the time when most French women normally start working for free if you consider the gender wage gap. International Women's Day strikes in Iceland and elsewhere have followed this logic in the past, and it's a powerful way to dramatize the issue of unequal pay. Also this year on International Women's Day, women in Ireland walked off the job to demand extending their recently won abortion rights to their comrades in Northern Ireland. Sex workers struck across Britain, demanding decriminalization and full workers' rights, reflecting a worldwide movement to recognize sex work as work and allow those in the oldest profession to make a living with safety and dignity. In Iceland, where International Women's Day strikes have long been a significant and powerful tradition, hotel housekeepers struck all day with the support of their unions. In Switzerland, major unions are organizing a women's strike of all their own for June 14th to protest a persistent and dramatic wage gap in that quite wealthy country. The strikes and walkouts and massive protests in so many countries this year reflect a global mobilization of women. Some scholars that I interviewed about this say. Cinzia Arruzza, a New School professor, when I spoke to her, called it a crisis of social reproduction. Austerity results in cutbacks to public services like childcare, schooling, and much more, which create more work for women at home, but also hammer them on the job, as many public sector workers providing this care are women. At the same time, by squeezing workers' wages and weakening their safety net, capital and its neoliberal regimes also create more violence against women, making it economically harder for women to leave abusive relationships and workplaces. Probably part of the reason that the Me Too movement, more than a hashtag, has resonated. Some feminist thinkers see this crisis hitting families in a very intimate realm. This is a little controversial, but I think it's interesting, so I'm going to throw it out there. Birth rates are low in rich countries, even now in the US, which has been a long holdout. In her new book on the subject, feminist activist Jenny Brown argues that low birth rates can be seen as a slowdown or strike over poor conditions for reproductive labor. When women work too many jobs or work too much, don't have good health care, can't afford childcare, face inflexible workplaces, can't count on good K through 12 education, many are withdrawing from the labor of bearing and raising children, choosing to have none or fewer. The restiveness has also been affecting private sector female workforces. We saw Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants, call for a general strike to end Trump's government shutdown. That didn't actually turn out to be necessary. But when she told the media that flight attendants were mobilizing immediately for a strike of their own, a few hours later, Trump did agree to provisionally reopen the government. One of the things that we're discovering is that women's labor is powerful and a necessary part of the economy, and there are a lot of political implications to that. Similarly, and also we're discovering that being organized and ready and willing to strike can be just as good as going on strike sometimes. The flight attendants actually didn't have to go on strike to have an impact. During negotiations, Sarah Nelson told me when I interviewed her, you have to be able to show the company that your workforce is ready to act. You can't just lead on policy. You can't lead by slamming your hand on the table. I've never seen management, when you walk in and make this impassioned argument at the table, that they sort of slap their head and go, "You're right, we should pay the flight attendants more." No, it's when you have a mobilized workforce who can go out, she said. Similarly, nurses in New York just made a credible strike threat, winning concessions from Mount Sinai Hospital for concessions that benefit us all, frankly, for safe nurse-to-patient ratios, so that you are not left with no nurse when you are bleeding to death in the hospital. One of the biggest work stoppages in the country right now concerns another predominantly female workforce. In New England, employees of the unionized grocery store Stop and Shop are on strike in 240 stores, mainly over the issue of higher healthcare premiums. Customers are refusing to cross the picket lines. Many stores have been temporarily closing. Analysts have estimated the company is losing about $2 million a week. And also keep in mind, this strike is now going into the holiday weekend, so this is a huge time of usually very profitable and great time for a supermarket because people are buying food for Passover and Easter and so forth, but not at Stop and Shop. Again, we're discovering women's work is very necessary to the economy, and to withdraw it can be powerful. The stakes for that strike are high, because if the workers can win, it will show it's not just highly skilled workers like teachers and nurses that can make gains in this way, and not just in the public sector. It will show that even in the private sector, a good union and a workforce ready to go out can make their jobs better. A lot of women's work has more leverage than the industries traditionally associated with male workers, like manufacturing. It's not as if, I mean, maybe the robots are coming for some cashiers, but it's not as if the work at a deli counter, any more than that of a school teacher, can be shipped overseas. Women have realized that corporations are not serious about addressing the obstacles they face. Hashtags aren't doing it, and neither can leaning in or bringing lawsuits, making new human resources policies. But going on strike just might. Thanks.
This is the panel that has the unhappy title. I think most of the day had very good. And because it's called Discrimination, it's something negative. I can't remember, but it's something along those lines.
It's something about discrimination.
And I think that is actually correct. What was wonderful during the day was the energy, the positive, very good things. But at the end of the day, it seems like
at the end
we
of the day,
know
we still have discrimination.
that there still is a lot of work to be done. And, but it is also so important to hear all the positives. You know, I just think that is absolutely wonderful. So hey, it's not my fault, but this panel is called Discrimination. There is not much positive that you can say about that. So, but I want to give it a turn. And I'll become a bit personal. I rarely do that so I came to the United States, as one does, as an illegal immigrant in the good days. That was a very easy operation. I was about 19, and I had $50. And I assumed in my innocence, I had grown up in Latin America, and Latin America tends to be generous with people. They become your mothers, you know, whether they know you or not. So I was not ready for New York, I'll say that. And anyhow, a whole bunch of stories, but I wound up with my first job, and again, I was about 19, as a cleaning woman, which actually many people I have discovered had that often as a first job, but a temporary condition. And being a cleaning woman meant that I got to know the other cleaning women in the neighborhood. It was a very fancy neighborhood, very, very fancy, very important American, I don't know what, but high position in the government. And so the cleaning women turned out to be, the ones that I got to know, nurses, trained as nurses from Caribbean countries. And that space was, of course, a space where one position is, this is not fair, this is not right, etc., you know, truth. But what impressed me so much about these women, I was far more impressed with them than with how I was managing it all, by the way. But they said, yeah, we're nurses. We want to be in this country because it's going to be better. And the only way we can do that is by not claiming we're nurses, because then immediately problems, etc., will be cleaners, and eventually they will need us as nurses. And that is, of course, we know that a lot of the nurses in the United States are actually foreign women, and many are from the Caribbean and from Philippines, etc. So I just want that as a context. Now, I want to invite us to think about the 1980s. In the 1980s, we deregulate, we privatize, and we globalize. And it's not just us, it happens, but let me just focus on the United States. Any complex economy is going to have inequality. There is just no way around that. But what happens in the 1980s is more than just the familiar inequality. And it is really, we begin to globalize, which means that big firms become even bigger and more powerful. They need this whole intermediate sector of highly specialized knowledges. If you are operating in Mongolia and need 20 hours of Mongolian accounting, by God, you're going to find in a city like New York or in Chicago or in LA, you're going to find that kind of firm. So what we have is one image that I have. It's as if a whole system installs itself in our cities, in our major cities, which is all kinds of very specialized but very partial, incomplete, if you want, forms of expertise. These firms need each other because they are providing the specialized knowledges that all kinds of big corporate firms need in order to enter the global economy, because that's the moment when we have long been in the global economy, but that's a different type of global economy. It's a different way of being in that economy. So what you have is, and again, the image, I want to repeat this image, the image is this, a whole system sort of installs itself in the cities. And you might remember, for instance, in the 1980s, on the one hand, New York was just broke. Paris was also broke, not officially broke. London was poor. So it was a very peculiar period, the end of the 1970s, because most major cities were actually impoverished because they belonged to an earlier era and they were not ready for the new era. The commentary about New York City was New York City's finished. As they are saying that, the experts, I have nothing against experts, but I can't resist mentioning this. So experts say, oh, New York City, well, the big corporates moved out, etc. But no, when you globalize and you want to, and many firms globalize, what you have is a whole new type of economy with all kinds of new needs of highly specialized knowledges. If you're a firm that is going to operate in 15 countries, in 28 countries, you need all kinds of expertise that you cannot produce in-house. That was sort of the basic idea. So we the cleaning women, we landed in that world. So we got to see also the inside of that whole economy. I just want to mention that. Now, the digital. So the digital also led people to think that cities, we're talking still the 1970s, 1980s, cities are finished. We don't need cities, but that was incorrect, right? But you have a lot of discourse coming from the digital experts saying, oh, the digital, we don't need cities, we can go anywhere. Mm-hmm. In fact, the cities became far more significant than anybody had expected. In that context, you have a whole new high-level class, high-income class, not the super rich. And so the image that I developed it was like a space where the space of the office work, which was very high-level work, and when talking very specialized firms, and the space of the home were like one kind of platform where everything had to work like clockwork. The women, the cleaning women who wound up working in those households had to make sure that everything was fine. Those women eventually, and we're talking Park Avenue in the case of New York, etc., they actually organized themselves. They, unlike the cleaning women in the suburbs, who did not succeed in organizing, because there was always an endless supply, but in this systematicity that I'm alluding to, there was no time. You wanted the best, and if they were good, you were going to pay them more. And I was part of this effort to organize the women. And the men who are the doorman, think Park Avenue as an image, but it was more than Park Avenue, clearly. And the men, the doormen, were actually great supporters of this effort that the cleaning women had to raise wages, etc. So this world of cleaning women in this kind of setting was quite extraordinary. And many of these women were very smart and well educated. And we still have, you may not know that, but we still have a formalized kind of a union. It's a kind of union. It is not the classical type of union, where these women are organized and they can make demands. And they actually get paid far better, typically, than women in sort of in middle class, you know, more modest, more. And so to me, that also was interesting, that coming back to where I started, the nurses, those nurses, which then became cleaning women, eventually actually have made enough connections that they became nurses in hospitals, you know. On the other hand, if you look at the middle-class suburban setups, I think that is where those cleaning women didn't go very far. You know, they were basically stuck in not great jobs. So I always was sort of very, very interested in this fact, the clarity of purpose that these nurses from the Caribbean who worked as cleaning women had. You know, they really, they sort of knew what they were doing. And now, the situation, I would say, I just want to finalize with another element, which is, I think, a very serious issue, and that is that what we're seeing right now in many big cities, and maybe some of you have seen the film Push, which is about how big corporations are buying up huge sort of modest income, often poor income housing complexes. I don't know if anybody is aware of what's happening. There is one big US-based corporation, which shall remain unnamed, at least for purposes of whatever, that is buying up these huge, modest income housing complexes in many different countries. And I don't know if people have seen, but there is a court issue, you know, this is serious stuff. And you have to stand back and ask, why? Why are they bothering to buy what are ultimately modest housing units? And one thing that is happening there is that, they can double the price. That's what they're doing. They upgrade the buildings, and again, it's in many different countries, including the United States, and they can get higher price, double the price, which already means they expel the more modest. But that would not be enough to explain. And so a second issue emerges. Why are they doing this? And as far as I can tell, the research that I've been doing with other people in other countries, what's happening is that those buildings are not just working as buildings, you know, for housing. They also work as elements to produce asset-backed securities. The high investment circuit does not want derivatives. The derivatives are for you and me. They want asset-backed securities. And so now, when I walk in some of these places and I see these buildings, including some of the empty buildings we have here in Manhattan, where you might say, oops, something went wrong. Not necessarily. They're working as something else, as a source to make asset-backed securities. Now, I want to end with the women. My experience with these women was one that allowed me to understand that the immediate image that you have of somebody, is just one image. So these were Afro-Caribbean women and modestly dressed, etc., when I first met them, but they turned out to be brilliant. The buildings, the materialities, we see them as buildings. Big towers, whether they are modest, sort of these big low-income operations, but they can also be something else. And that something else, and this is what I'm working on now, we are a network of people from different countries, is the extent to which an empty, now I'm talking luxury building, an empty luxury building can actually deliver more profits than an occupied. But why? Because once you have people in there, they're going to be complaining. But still, that's not enough. The other element is that given, algorithmic mathematics, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about these fancy instruments, that has nothing to do with microeconomics. That means that a building, what we see, I repeat myself, that building actually elsewhere through several steps of algorithmic mathematics is a field of assets. The reason the big corporation, this particular corporation, is buying up modest housing complexes everywhere is not just to make that little more money off the upgraded building. It is also because it's a search for assets to generate those asset-backed securities. And that to me is enormously alarming. So I am forever, I'm now moving, you understand, I want to bring the nurses back in, the women. But I'm forever grateful to those Caribbean nurses who made me understand that the situation A, or X, whatever, can actually bring about a whole very, very different modality. So the X is one thing, but the X can also be something else. I don't know if that helps at all, but anyhow, thank you very much.
Thank you. I was in a really inspiring meeting with Ai-jen Poo last week, and she was talking about how her organization has been using the movie Roma as an organizing tool and arranging screenings for congressmen and women about it, and then also using the film to get attention to the domestic workers' rights bill, which I think is in Congress. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious to know, both of you who've written so much about, women and labor, or maybe Saskia, if this speaks to any of your earlier experiences, or Liza, have you followed this kind of work on narrative change and what you think of it? And especially when I'm thinking also about all the Walmart women, how do you get society to sort of move and become interested in these forgotten women? And do things like movies actually help? Either of you want to?
Well, I got involved when I was in Los Angeles, the early 1980s. That is where the first organization of women around the question of housing, well, they were mostly, again, housekeepers, etc. And they were they knew what they wanted. I don't know if you're asking something more specific, but that was in California. And there were also men organizing. And the men eventually, they were janitors, the men were the janitors, right? And the men eventually did get, I don't know if you're aware of this, but throughout Europe and also in the United States, but in the major cities, the janitors that work in these major buildings, so this is not anywhere, are actually organized. There is a union, there is an international union. And the women were trying to do that, but the problem is that most of the women who work in households are actually not working in the kind of situation that I was describing. They're working in very sort of middle class, etc. So that's more difficult. But there is supposedly a union that started in Los Angeles 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I think there's efforts now for women to have portable benefits, right? Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. As to your question about narrative change, I think that, I'm a journalist and I like to tell women workers' stories, and I think that it has some cultural impact, but I don't think people telling their stories has as much effect as we in the media like to think, to be honest. This Me Too moment is also very predicated in many ways on the idea that women will tell their stories and then things will change. as a storyteller myself, I don't want to say that's useless, but I think that for too long, maybe we've put a bit too much emphasis
Absolutely.
on
I
that.
thought-
And what really helps is building power and being in the position to get the
I
legislation
think why I
done.
was so impressed by iGen presentation was because the narrative change was so clearly tied to policy goals.
Yes.
And she made another point that I hadn't thought of, which is when you get change ahead of narrative change, then you can lose it, like Obamacare, right? So we got an improvement on healthcare, but we forgot to bring sort of the narrative. And now, think of all the places like Kentucky and Tennessee where it wasn't branded as federal government. And so then people turned against it because they thought it was Kentucky Connect or Tennessee Care or something like that.
But I think that you could equally say, and maybe this is another way of saying the same thing, that sometimes you get the change without organizing, and then it's not going to be a lasting change. I think we've certainly made that mistake in the reproductive rights movement, that we get the change legislatively or legalistically, and we don't spend a lot of time talking to people about why this is important.
Right. And then I guess my last question before we turn it over to the audience is the elections. How are these strikes going to play out in the U.S. elections? Is this, I mean, obviously Alex Herto Fernandez's book just came out about the declining power of unions and how disastrous that's been for the Democratic Party. Is there any hope? And then I don't know, Saskia, if you want to tell us a little bit about, Europe and what's going on, how all your ideas really about the 1980s in a way laid the bedrock for a lot of the alarming populism that we've seen in Europe now.
Well, so in terms of the United States, I mean, I feel like we are all so tired already of our election, but it's just getting started. But in terms of the strikes and the elections, it's interesting how, to me, how for instance, the Stop and Shop strike, I mean, these fairly low-wage workers going on strike throughout New England that both, I mean, Elizabeth Warren, of course, she's a senator from Massachusetts, but Joe Biden not only was out on the picket line with them, but I keep getting emails from him about how important unions are, and they're like, I'll see you on the picket line, Joe. It's kind of funny because you don't think of him as being the most radical candidate in the race. But I think we're in this moment where labor, especially women's labor, actually is taking center stage in an interesting political way that even someone like Joe Biden, who's fully owned by the credit card industry, feels he has to convince me that he's going to see me on the picket line. I mean, that's not bad.
Well, I think that something is happening. I think this is not the same period as right after the in the 1980s when we globalize, deregulate, and all of that. It's taken a very long time for the workforces, but also those who are, who work with and enable, like the economists and the blah blah, to actually focus on this. But we have long had this institute. I can't remember, but that is an excellent institute based in DC that has kept its eye, on the worker side and interpreted our economy from that angle, the good and the bad. When you look at the newspapers mostly focus on the economy in terms of what the economists, I don't mean economists as in the academy, what I mean is the people who are running those firms. That is a real problem because that has rendered invisible the two things that I was talking about, both these women and these men, with all the limitations of their success, like it was really Park Avenue where it worked, etc. So and I also, you said it in passing, I think women are key actors. I think women are positioned right now in a few sectors, which are like, being nurses and, a variety of sectors where they can exercise a certain set of demands. I also think that New York might not be the easiest place you know?
Yeah.
But that other sort of medium-sized cities will enable that much more. I mean, my foundational position, I just have to put that on the table, is that the kind of economic system that we have right now is, to me, a horror.
Oh, a horror.
It's unjust.
Yeah.
The concentration of wealth is excessive. The way workers are exploited, the way workers who used to have rights have lost those rights. I mean, what begins to manifest clearly in the 1980s is something that has become much worse than at the time we could have predicted. Now, none of our economies is all going to be marked by total justice and equality. It's just not on. But it doesn't have to be as bad as it is now, I think.
Absolutely.
And I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
On that unhappy note.
Yeah. Anybody want to ask anything or say anything? Brief?
They're overwhelmed with the negatives.
No.
Well, we have elections next year.
Our elections, that will make it all much better. Let's hope.
All right. And then-
Can I ask a question to the, I'm sorry. How many of you are sort of in contact, I'm just curious to know, in contact with cleaners and, you know, with those kinds of positions? In other words, people we really need, they are continuously around us, but we don't necessarily get to know them, you know? How many? Can I just see? Oh, yes, 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 great. That's quite a few. That is very nice to know. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I could get started on that. I have a totally feudal relationship where I try to put my cleaners' children through college and tutoring, so I've had a whole window on some of the obstacles and how difficult it really is. Yeah, no, it's very, very absorbing and upsetting sometimes. So, good. In that case, okay, last person, and then we will.
Has a question?
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. That's right, absolutely. No, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good.
I wanted to raise a famous story, since you're interested in cleaning women, about Barbara Johnson. And she basically also, she was an illegal immigrant. She came from Poland, and she got a job as a cleaning woman at the Johnson house called the people who own Johnson & Johnson Company, which is one of the biggest corporations in the United States. And it turned out she had a master's degree in art history. And somehow or other, she started talking to the owner about the fantastic paintings he had and all this. And she impressed him so much that he married her. So all of a sudden, she became a billionaire, you know, so talking about opportunities.
Upward social mobility.
Very good.
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Alingusik. I'm a SIPA student as well. And actually, I saw Professor Sassen in my college when I was an undergraduate many years ago. So it's nice to be here now, a bit more informed. My question is actually touches on Roma. I do have, my family has women who has helped for more than 50 years, and to me, she's like a second mother. I mean, I grew up in a household where we empower her, we help her family, and I also used to work in Mexico's Social Security institution, which appears on Roma. So to me, that movie just touches on so many different levels. Yeah. Now, in an effort to expand social insurance in Mexico, now domestic workers have the right to access Social Security, which I think is great. But I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit or expand on some more policies to both empower these type of women and to also protect their rights as a workforce, because they are very important. Unfortunately, I think in Mexico it does happen that they are most often discriminated and most often treated like a just a labor unit and not a person. So just
look, it mostly, I think, as I said, even in this country, you can see that also rather clearly. There has been two trends. One is a loss of rights. A decline in income on the part of all kinds of low-wage workers. And on the other hand, a new sort of effort to organize, you see it, I mean, I think this is really happening. There was a kind of a dead period in the 1980s, early 1990s, and now I can see really that something is mobilizing. So that is one way of putting it. The other thing is what's happening in South America. I grew up in South America, and there you have quite a bit of organizing by women. Women are also very maltreated. This is no rosy zone, but I sense that it's a period for women more than for men. Mm-hmm. That it's like a wake-up call and a sense of, yes, you know, I am me. I'm not the wife or whatever. You know, I mean, you really have a sense of a certain kind of energy and that I find very interesting, you know. I mean, look, I'm not an expert on all of this, I mean, but I notice a difference, and you see it in many places. I also think that the question of gendering, you know, has made more and more women are in lesbian relationships, and that is also an enablement. You know, there are multiple little elements that are in play to give women a kind of autonomy that they have not had, or that they had to hide a bit. So I don't know, I think it's sort of an interesting period for women, certainly in our major developed countries. You also see it in Africa. I've been in some places in Africa where the women are the entrepreneurs. That is a long history actually in some African places, but now they're doing it better, because before then the men would grab. So I think something is sufficiently unsettled in the ordinary way of doing stuff, that every now and then you see these manifestations, you know, this, I don't mean manifestation as I mean sort of emergent novel conditions, that's what I mean, which I find very interesting. But mind you, most women are still oppressed. This is very clear. Let's not be.
We actually had a conference on campus 2 weeks ago with the ILO, and we had a representative there from the, I'm trying to remember now if it was the Domestic Workers Alliance or the National Coalition of Domestic Workers. I may be mangling the names, and apologies. But anyway, they did talk about, so there's been this new bill in Congress, and there's a move for portable benefits. Mm-hmm. So I can dig up some information, because I bet you'd like to talk to them while you're here. Mm-hmm. We've invited Ija Poo many times. It's hard to get her, but she has other colleagues, and they've been doing really a tremendous job of organizing domestic workers. This is really Liza's subject, so I'll give you the last word.
Not
yes,
really,
yes.
not. No, the particular question isn't at all. But I think Saskia is right that we're in this interesting moment where horrifically we're seeing large groups of workers lose rights that they had struggled to win for decades. Like we just saw the Janus Supreme Court decision, which deprived many workers of union organizing rights. And on the other hand, we're also seeing some groups of workers that never had these rights in the first place are getting closer to winning them, like the domestic workers legislation that Anya's referring to, that we see at the federal level, and also at the New York State level. We have our own version of that in the works, and with sex workers and farm workers and other groups that have sort of been historically left out of this sort of labor, like sort of civilized labor contract, so it is a good time, I think, to be fighting for those historically precarious workers. If a bad time to be a regular person, because a lot of people are losing their rights. So,
sure.
Yeah.
No,
right.
we'll keep fighting. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. Good. So I think this is it, the end of the panel, and thank you all for coming, and thanks again to Ned and Viviana for organizing this, and Lizzie for doing so much work. What a incredible